Okay, so we're in week 2 of this series that we're calling ClickBait, and the whole idea behind ClickBait is if you've been strolling online or whatever, seen online stuff, there's always some very provocative title to some article about how you won't believe what happened when he did this, and you're like, what did he do? I have to click on that, and then you go there, and it's like you get rickrolled. You guys remember getting rickrolled? No? Never gonna give you, never gonna, I don't know the words, but yeah, it'd be some link or some dumb thing going on, but that's clickbait. It kind of is meant to draw you in and get you to drive ad sales or whatever. But I also, we did this series because the Bible is full of clickbait type things, but they're actually true, which is kind of the crazy part of it. And so today's clickbait title, or whatever you want to call it, is this. Government official officially cured from the incurable. How could this happen? I don't know. That's the best I got for that, but that's what it is. So ultimately, we're talking about faith today because I think that faith is one of the most important things that we need in this life. Faith is us saying yes even when we are unsure. Faith is us believing something that God has said or wants and then doing something about it. Faith is never just a cognitive thing. It is always accompanied by actions. Faith is saying, yes, I believe this, and so I'm going to act on what I believe. Faith is not just in your head. It's movement and obedience as well. And so here's the phrase that I want you to keep in mind all day long today. A little bit of faith can change everything. A little bit of faith can change everything. In order for us to live our lives well for Jesus, or maybe you haven't given your life to Jesus and you're just in this place trying to figure that out, either way, it requires some faith to do that. And even with a small amount of faith, I believe that Jesus can do amazing things in our lives. The smallest, tiniest amount of faith leads us to the step of obedience. And when we take that step of obedience, that's when God proves himself to us. It's an important statement here. I think God doesn't really prove himself to you unless you're obedient in faith. Doesn't grab you, wring your neck, or anything like that. He shows up more and more when we're obedient. God has a chance to actually prove himself when we say, I believe you, and I'm going to do something about it. Now, we're going to go all the way back into the Old Testament today to the book of 2 Kings, and I want to tell you a story about a man named Naaman. It may be a familiar story for some of you may be brand new. Either way, it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and I say that about every story that I preach, so take it for what it is. Now, everything's going to be on the screen, but the notes and stuff in your bulletin, we left that pretty blank today because really the thing that I need you to remember more than anything is that a little bit of faith can change everything. So you can write that down, you can fill that out, whatever you want. You can post that on social media, however you feel like remembering that. 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 14, we're going to meet a man named Naaman. It says of Naaman, he was a commander of the army of the king of Aram. Now, I don't know who the king of Aram was. I did not do the research for that. If anybody knows who that person is, you can text me later, and we'll go from there. But Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. Naaman, he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He, Naaman, was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, by all accounts, Naaman was the man. He was great at his job. The city loved him. His boss loved him. The soldiers under his command loved him. God blessed him with many victories, and he was brave. It could be said of Naaman that he was Joel Osteening. He was living his best life. Everything was going great for Naaman, but Naaman had leprosy, an incurable skin condition that kills you eventually. It's contagious. It's a living nightmare. It's a death sentence, which equals desperation in your life. And when it was known that someone had leprosy, they were shunned and alone. Because of his leprosy, there was a huge emotional toll, causing him to live in secret, to live in shadows, and to be lonely. Naaman's life was great, but everyone has a but. Now grow up, Andrew. You know what I'm talking about. You can say, I have a home, I have food, I have health, but, and there's always a but, I'm sorry, that we choose to focus on instead of the blessings that God has for us, right? There's always something for us to go, yeah, I know that I have all of these things, but blah, 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 blah. Naaman ultimately had a great life. He loved the Lord, and he still had a but in his life. Now, on one of the raids of Naaman's army, one of the raids of the Jewish people, Naaman captured a young Jewish girl and brought her home to be a servant for his wife. Now, the young Jewish girl who was captured and is now a slave, she gets wind of Naaman's condition, and this is what she says in verse 3. If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Oh, let's talk about the faith of someone right here. A little girl taken from her home, made to be a slave in somebody else's house. She has enough faith to step up and to say to somebody, if only you would go see the prophet, he can cure this incurable thing that you have. Okay? I mean, just to even say that out loud in that position as a slave girl, that requires a bit of faith. Now, spoiler alert, we're going to find out in a minute that all of this works out pretty well for Naaman. But can we just take a second to pay attention to the position of the person who provided the solution? The slave girl, the nobody, the nothing. Someone who, by all accounts, should have been angry, bitter, and resentful. But rather than waking up and choosing violence, she chose to offer a solution to her master's problem. Here's something I think we can learn from that. Because often we find ourselves in less than ideal situations, and rather than being solution-oriented, all we do is sit in our mess and pout. The only time this girl is mentioned is when she, as a slave, offers a graceful and restorative solution. She could have easily withheld this information, and no one would have blamed her. So, she tells Naaman. Naaman goes and tells his boss, and I'm kind of like making this a little bit more succinct, but Naaman goes and tells his boss about what the slave girl said, and Naaman's boss, the king of Aram, says, hey, by all means, go. You have my full support. Take 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, 10 of these Brooks Brothers suits, and go get yourself healed. Brooks Brothers is an old company. So Naaman arrives he packs up everything. He arrives in Israel. He goes straight to the king of Israel, and he tells them, hey, king of Israel, I have come here to be cured of this incurable disease. And so the king of Israel's response is to tear his clothes in anger and in fear and in desperation and rage, because he thinks that the king of Aram is coming to pick a fight with him because he thinks that leprosy is incurable. You get what I'm saying here? So, hey, we're going to send you over there to do this thing to Israel, and then when it doesn't work out, we're going to attack them, and that's going to be our excuse. So that's what the king of Israel is thinking. So he freaks out about what's going on. But in verse 8, when Elisha, the man of God, and he's talking about Elisha the prophet, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Okay. Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. Can I translate that for you into modern English? Dude, relax. I got this. All right? That's the literal translation. Now, I want you to notice that the man of God, the prophet, he is totally calm in the face of this trouble. Totally calm in the face of this trouble, in the face of the king who is freaking out. Now, the only way for us to remain calm in a situation that we find ourselves in is to trust God more than our own ability. This is what Elisha is doing. He's trusting God more than his own ability. And for us, we need to do the same thing, to trust God more than our own ability. See, many times we find ourselves in a terrible situation or something happens in our life, and all we want to do is think of a way to fix it. And if we don't come up with a solution for that fairly quickly, we tend to fall into fear and despair. And this happens to us more and more when we trust our own ability over what God is doing or can do in our lives. When we lack faith, a little bit of faith can change everything. Trusting in our own ability is a fool's errand. We get stuck, frustrated, become apathetic if we only trust in ourselves. But here's the man of God telling the king, relax. God's got this. And so verse 9, Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. All right, here's what this makes me think of, all right? These prophets were broke. Like, they didn't have anything. They didn't have a lot of money. They weren't wealthy. They didn't have Bentleys or anything like that. But this makes me think, and this is so ridiculous. I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. But it makes me think of when you had prom, and for the first time in your life, a limo pulled up in front of your house, and you felt like such a baller for a minute, like there's finally fancy things going on in my life. Well, Naaman and his horses and chariots is like that limo pulling up in front of this ragged house that has no business being in a limo anyway, all right? Listen, all right. I told you guys that I think of things differently, and it's weird sometimes, okay? So there you go. That was an example. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger out to say to him, Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. Now, this is hilarious to me. And if you look for funny in the Bible, you will find funny in the Bible. And this is funny in the Bible to me. Elisha doesn't even come out. He is unimpressed by Naaman's limousine. He sends someone out with the instructions. Why? Why couldn't he just go out there? Who knows? Nobody knows. Maybe he was cooking or watching The Office, didn't want to miss something. But to me, this just shows how sometimes we think our problems are so big and so insurmountable, and God is chilling with the remote going, hey, I got it. Listen, God is never worried about how something is going to happen. Never. And since he loves us and we're his children, we also should not be worried about how something is going to happen. Elisha's faith is so strong that he knows he doesn't even need to be involved other than to deliver the instructions. Follow the instructions and watch God show up. Take a step of faith into obedience and watch God show up. That's it. That's all he has to do. Go dip himself in the Jordan 7 times. Anybody wonder why 7 times? Me too. Answer doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. 7 was the number. It could have been 36 or 42 or 3. It could have been anything. It doesn't matter. 7 was the number, and there was no negotiating. Now, with such simple instructions for how to have his leprosy cured, Naaman should be elated, right? right? I mean, we're Monday morning quarterbacking here a little bit, but we think Naaman should be elated. That's it? That's all I have to do? Sweet. No, that was not his reaction. In verse 11, Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Arbana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters in Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? And so he turned and went off in a what? All right, Naaman, come on, man. He's saying here, he's like, God, you're not going to do what I want to do how I want you to do it, so I'm not going to do the thing that I'm asking you to do for me. I don't want your help if you're not going to do it how I want you to do it. Have you ever avoided something that you knew God wanted you to do because you didn't like the instructions on how to do that? I think most often this happens relationally with people. You know, we're commanded to forgive. We're commanded to love. We're commanded to serve. I remember a time when I asked God to, I was praying and I was like, hey, I'm available. Like, put somebody in my way. I was praying for God to put people in my way. And a couple days went by, and, it was about 9:30 at night one night, and somebody knocked on the door, which, by the way, somebody knocking on your door, it's like, I don't know about you guys, but I freak out about that, like the world is on fire or something, but anyway. But it was my next door neighbor. He knocked on the door, and it was his wife, and she knew I was in ministry and all that, and she told me about all of the child pornography that she had just found on her husband's computer with him standing there next to me. And so I closed the door and I said, Jesus, that's not what I was talking about at all. But he put them in my way and in our way, and, we were not equipped to do that, but we were able to get them to the people who were equipped to help them deal with that stuff. I tell you that story because when I said, God, I'm available, I meant like a flat tire or somebody who needs jumped in the parking lot or whatever that might be. But I wonder how often we avoid being obedient to what Jesus is asking simply because we don't like what he's asking us to do. I think there's a hard truth that we need to understand. When God speaks, he isn't haggling. He's not, the Bible's not like a buffet where you can pick and choose, or Chipotle where you can just leave out what you don't want. We're meant to obey. And when God speaks, he isn't haggling. Down in verse 13, Naaman's run off in a huff. It says, Naaman's servants went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, take a bath? I want to point out that it's the servants in this story who are great. The slave girl, Naaman's servant going to tell him what to do, and even the servant who delivered the message from Elisha. None of the main characters are doing anything in the story. It's all the servants. The people that we might have least expected to make an impact, they're literally the ones who believe that God is going to do something here. Church, I need us to learn from that. It does not matter what our position is in this life or how much money we make or what our job title is. You and I, anyone can be a faithful servant of Jesus regardless of your station in life. Truthfully, those were the least people, and they're the heroes of the story. Naaman was used to doing things by his own great force. He was very comfortable relying on himself. But here's God telling him to do something very simple, to cure an incurable disease. And Naaman's response is to throw a hissy fit. And his servants come up to him and they say, "Are you mad, bro?" I'll translate this for you too. Dude, stop being a baby. Go do what God is telling you to do. Anybody ever had anybody say something like that to them? Knock it off. Stop being a brat. Do what you know you're supposed to do. And you go and do it, and maybe it turns out okay. A little bit of faith can change everything. So Naaman decides to listen, stop pouting, and take this one little step into obedience. And look at verse 14. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. When Naaman did exactly what the prophet told him to do, God fulfilled his promises. God did not fulfill the promise on the 3rd dip, the 4th dip, or the 6th dip. He fulfilled his promise when Naaman was fully obedient. To me, this means that the words of God can be trusted. A promise of God is fulfilled when we are obedient. And so here's something else for us to take away. Reluctant obedience is still what? Obedience. Yeah. Reluctant obedience is still obedience. For Naaman, the only way he could have been obedient is if he had the smallest amount of faith. It was the smallest amount of faith for him to agree to go and do something. But when he finally took that step of faith and agreed to go and do what he was told to do, God showed up, even though his faith was small. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that Naaman's faith shrank, stayed the same, or grew when he came out of the water the 7th time? You're all right, but you said that really like you were really unsure if you were right about the answer to that. I heard everybody said the right answer. So do you think Naaman's faith shrank, stayed the same, or grew when he came out of the water the 7th time? It grew. All right, that's exactly right. It grew. Thank you, Larissa. It grew. But it only grew because in faith, that much, he was obedient. His faith did not grow until he was obedient. A little bit of faith can change everything. And for us, our faith will grow even if we are reluctantly obedient to God's words. When we are obedient to God's words, that is when God can fulfill his promises. Leprosy at this time was a huge deal. It was a big insurmountable thing. And, in our minds, it might require a huge and complicated miracle to be healed. But the only healing required, the healing only required enough faith to be obedient, and ultimately obedient to something very, very small. So let me ask you, have you ever faced a huge, insurmountable mountain in your life? Maybe it's your marriage, or your job, or your finances, or a disease, or whatever it is. Naaman was obedient with the smallest amount of faith, and God showed up big time. Big time. A little bit of faith can change everything. Faith is the first step in God's plan to change your life. If your faith is small, if it's a tiny little seed that hasn't started growing, I would encourage you to say yes to whatever it is you think Jesus is leading you to go do. No matter how big or how small that thing might be. A little bit of faith can change everything. So what step of faith do you need to make today? What step of faith might you need to make today? Do you need to start something? Do you need to stop something? Do you need to repent and come back to God? Do you need to give your life to Him for the first time? I want to encourage you to ask yourself, what is God leading me to do? And I want to encourage you to ask yourself that question during communion. Now, you have your little packet here of communion, and if you'll open the top layer of that, you can get the cracker out. If anybody needs one, Mike is in the back, and he'd be more than happy to deliver you one. One of the things that I think happens in life is that we forget that Jesus is meant to be in the center of our life, that our life is meant to revolve around Him, that He's not some ancillary toy that we take out and play with whenever we, have a problem or feel bad or need a new car or whatever it is. But that He is meant to be the center of our life, and our lives are meant to rotate around Him. So maybe there's something in your life that is not allowing that to happen. Maybe it's a fear that you're not able to say yes to something God is leading you to. So this is why I want us to ask ourselves today, God, what are you leading me to? What step of faith do I need to take? I want to encourage you to make that your prayer. As you take the cracker, which represents the body of Jesus that hung on the cross, and as you drink the juice, which is representative of His blood that was shed so